Hi, welcome to part 2. This is the rubric for scoring online learning objects for the International Workshop on Online Learning. I'm Dr. Mina Johnson-Glenberg at ASU and also the director of the Embodied Games for Learning Lab. So, we are the second generation of instructional designers. The first generation was basically took textbooks, scanned them, and turned them into PDFs. So it was no surprise that the first meta-analyses done on learning with technology found that there were little to no differences between the tech-infused classrooms and the control classrooms. So I'm thinking specifically about a 4-year tech immersion study done in Texas with over 40 classrooms and the Mathematica study that was published in 2007. Now that data would have been gathered around 2004, 2005, and those were very early days for online learning or learning via computers. For us second-generation designers, the world has really changed since then. We have many more tools. We now have affordable graphics, programs, and programmers and developers are becoming more abundant. Unity and Unreal engines are helping to ease games into this sort of content, not that they're all being designed well. We have a new generation of very tech-savvy teachers, well, certainly more than a decade ago. Increased bandwidth means we can put so much more media-rich content out there. So really, once again, do we have too many choices? Maybe we need to standardize what a strong learning object would look like. So as you design, do you ponder constructs like this? And I'm not making fun of Wooters at all. This is a lovely way to think about an integrative framework for the design of animated models. The gray rectangles, which you can't really see very well here, represent dependent variables. The white rectangles with discontinuous arrows represent moderating factors. Continuous arrows represent causal relations, and the arrows that go up are good and the ones that go down are bad, such that the bad arrow on intrinsic cognitive load, you don't want that, but the up arrow on germane cognitive load, you do want that. I don't think you think that way when you're designing. And I don't think you think this way either. Let's make certain that every learner has not overreached his peak capacity load. Maybe you do, though. I think that as designers, we're better served by thinking with rubrics, right? So this is a rubric from 2007 on video game higher order thinking skills. So it's very simple. It's not abstract. You get a 0 or a 1 if you hit these categories. So what we did at ASU about a year ago or so was sit down and think about a learning object rubric for the quality of these online objects, right? So I'm calling it LORQ for now. It's a draft version, and we're very excited that you're going to be here, and perhaps you can help us refine this. So it's the penultimate version, and we would love your feedback. I'll tell you what it's not for. It's not for an entire course. We have something called Quality Matters for that. It's not for documentary-style videos or passive watching case-based examples. It's really for people who are trying to create multimedia learning objects or 1-hour lessons, modules, things like that for a classroom. You know what those look like. I mean, they're called different names: vignettes, interactive simulations, mini lessons. Whenever I design what I often call a module, I'm always mindful of how I can harness the power of the computer, using often AI, to enhance learning. Really, one of the big beefs I have is the lack of generativity that's built into many lessons. And so in part 1, I talked about what generativity is, and that means that the learner is generating or creating something meaningful during the act of learning. This needs to be encouraged during the lesson, and it should be assessed creatively as well. And unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about assessment, but it is one of my favorite topics. So if you want to see me later and talk about it, or go to my website and see what I've written on it, I would encourage you to do that. In the rubric, there are 2 mandatory sections. The first is structure, and so all we're doing there is scoring the mechanics of how the object was built and how it was segmented. It's sort of quantity, right? And the second part is the pedagogy of the object, and that's primarily the quality of it. Now, I'm not an expert in what you would have made, right? I don't know much about carbon decay, but I do know what good pedagogy looks like and how you might want to teach something like that. So the scale is weighted to look for people who have used generativity or concepts of constructive learning in the content. I don't judge the quality of the content, just the pedagogy that you're surrounding the content with. There's a final section on assessment, but that's optional. So when you add together structure and pedagogy, you're going to get a score that approaches 100. Let's discuss the categories and the weightings, and then your homework is going to be to score a module. And when you show up in December, let's talk about that, okay? In the face-to-face session, we can compare scores. I'm calling this LORQ for now, Learning Object Rubric for Quality. In the LORQ, there is an NA category. It stands for not available. So there's 13 categories and 6 columns. The NA column is a bit of a hedge here. So what I'm saying is that if a learning object was really not designed to have this component in it at all, then it seems unfair to give it a 0. And you can give it a 1 because it was not available, and it would be awkward to put it in there. I'll show you an example of that. So here's what it looks like, and you can download it from my website. We start with structure, as I said. And the range is 0, 1, or 2. So 0, not present. 1, it's present. 2, it's present and deemed of high quality. So first thing, the descriptions. Does the learning object have a title, author, the average time it takes to complete it, what audience is it for, and several of the keywords? That seems pretty obvious. You'd be surprised how many don't even start with those. So if they only have 3 or 2, they get a 1. If they have all 5 of those are present, they get a 5. And so that gets put over in the score column on the right. Learning objectives. Many don't state these either. However, if they have stated the objective, they're explicit, the objective is measurable and attainable, then it would get a 2 over in the score column on the far right. Well segmented. This is hard to describe. And actually at the back of this, I'll have a glossary that describes what I mean by these things, and sometimes articles that people can go look up for more information, because I just can't put everything here in this one 2-page rubric. I was trying hard to keep it 2 pages. It's not segmented at all. There's no conceptual chunking. That would get a 0. Some efforts have been made for appropriate segmentation. For example, the module can be paused and people can think about it. That would get a 1. If it's done with the best segmenting and chunking practices, then it would get a 2. So for example, you would never want a video clip to go longer than 20 minutes. Number 4, user interaction. So again, this is the quantity of the interaction, not the quality. That's in the next section. No interactivity would get a 0. 1 or 2 interactive components. For example, the user controls the pacing. They might have a search function. That would get a 1. If you have more than 2 instances of interaction, so maybe there's a game in there or multiple places for the learner to be generative, that would get a 2. Accessibility. Is it designed so that individuals with visual and hearing impairments are not at a disadvantage? And here's a good website to look for those, the tenets for that. This is a place I always fall short on, so I need to work more on my accessibility. I know that. You would get a 2 if it was highly accessible for the majority of users, such that images are tagged for the blind, transcript of the module can be printed, etc. Number 6, is it adaptive? And this is again quantity. Are there a number of sequences of learning that are based on performance? So if there's some user performance is taken into account during the lesson, like how the user did at time t-1, moves to a different branch, then it would get a 1. But if there's more than 2 instances of highly adaptive content, many branches and or the questions are based on ongoing performance, then it would get a 2. And adaptivity is hard to add, we know that. You would take those 6, tally them up for a raw score, and then multiply that by 3.33. All right, that's section 1. Section 2, the pedagogy. And here's where we get into the quality. 7. Number 7 of section 2. Interactivity, the quality. There are multiple multimedia components that are designed with best design principles of practice. So you would get a 1 if there were only 1 or 2 components, but they're pretty low level. So for instance, if you just click on a target or there's only 1 component, you get a 1. You get a 2 if the majority of the interactivity supports tasks and follows best design principles, such that graphics and descriptive text should be in the same window. Many of these tenets come from Ritchie Mayer and Sweller, etc. Generative, the highest form of interactivity. This encourages students to actively construct their knowledge and output. So if you have 1 or 2 instances of, say, a quiz, or you have some multiple choice answers in there and get immediate feedback, or you're sorting objects, that would be a 1. And I have some footnotes here to show you an example of a fairly nice lesson that got a 1 on the back with a link. What would get a 2 is a module that supports multiple instances of creative generation, such that there's both interactivity and generativity. The answers are created by the learners. The learner could construct a model, like dragging molecules around to create a more complex model, or we could use natural language processing to score the free text that they type in. I have a strong example of that from Writing Pal, which is here at ASU. 9, metacognition. Does it encourage metacognition or Bloom's higher order thinking skills, strategies? The module would get a 1 if only 1 or 2 higher level strategies were in there, or there was 1 higher and 1 lower level strategy. For example, prompting for a prediction in the middle of the learning, or if it had some memorization tasks. The module would get a 2 if it encourages multiple instances of constructs such as question generation, that's very metacognitive, summarization, application, synthesis, are they being asked to evaluate something? Number 10, interaction among learners. So this is more for an entire classroom. Are there 1 or 2 interactions between learners? Are these encouraged? And I would get a 2 if there was interaction with others that's thoughtfully interwoven into the learning object. Like it could be part of class evaluation that you peer review what your peer has done. And again, at ASU, we have a nice example of that called CritViz, which has a link in the footnote. See, many learning objects don't have interaction in them or encouraged, and sometimes it's impossible. Like the one I'm going to ask you to score, it was designed to just teach you straight out these 4 terms used in centripetal force, so there's no interaction between students. So maybe that might get an NA, that might get a 1, or you might want to ding it with a 0. 11, real world and diverse examples. So is it authentic? Authenticity should be encouraged because that helps motivation and sense making and transfer. So if it only has 1 or 2 diverse examples or real world examples, it would get a 1. But if it has many relevant diverse examples, that helps anchor the content well and will encourage transfer to other topics, and that would get a 2. Number 12, feedback to the learner, very important. No feedback gets a 0. Limited feedback gets a 1. But if there are 3 or more instances of feedback that are consistently more than simple right or wrong distinctions or those sort of true-false questions that I dislike so much, then it gets a 2. And finally, the last one is their alignment in the module with the stated objectives. No, somewhat, or fully. And I know that sounds simple, but again, many learning objects will state a learning objective, and then at the end you get through it and you're like, wait a minute, I didn't learn anything about radioactive decay. You'll take that raw score, sum it, and then multiply it by 4.29, and that's going to give you a certain number that's weighted. So actually, this section on pedagogy is weighted heavier than the section on structure. It's harder to do good pedagogy. And then you sum those 2 numbers and they'll approach 100. So everyone knows what 100 means, right? This 3rd section is optional. It's on assessment. If it's in the learning object, then use this to score it. If not, then don't penalize it, right? So assessment is its own separate thing that would get a score that approaches 100 as well. Assessment here, in this first box, this first cell, it refers to both formative, that means during the act of learning, and summative assessment. That means at the end of the learning object. So a 1 would be given if there's only summative and it's quite low level, like true-false questions. A 2 would be given if both types are present and there's appropriate placement of the formative items. It's aligned with the learning goals and it encourages some generativity in the responses. Feedback. Feedback should be tightly temporally linked with performance. Also, a distinction is made between evaluative, which is a verbal type of feedback, versus numerical feedback. So a 1 would be awarded if there was only 1 or 2 instances of feedback, and a 2 if there are multiple instances of both numerical and evaluative or verbal feedback. Verbal meaning textual. It doesn't have to be auditory. And a strong example of that is in the blind man game that I'll show you. Adaptive test items. This is very hard, okay? I get that. If you have 1 branch or 1 adaptive test item, you would get a 1. If you have multiple branches or test items based on prior performance, you would get a 2. Sum all those. The highest raw score would be 6. And so then you would multiply that by 16.67 to approach 100. All right. What would an innovative module with generativity built into it look like? I'm going to show you some stills of blind man bluff simulation, and you can go to my website and look at it as well. I can give you a code to log on to that. It's not perfect, I know that. This is what we aspire to. This rubric is what you should aspire to. I've never seen one that's gotten 100, to be honest. Students go through a 20-minute long module. Embedded are 17 multiple choice and open-ended questions. The answers are scored in real time. So the multiple choice answers are scored in real time, and then the typed out questions, we give some credit for a number of words, but it's not a very sophisticated algorithm. It does feed, all this information feeds the algorithm that's used to see how kids are doing on the impressometer. What is that? The impressometer sits at the bottom of the screen, and it lets you as the user know how you're impressing the grad students, because you want to join their lab, right? So if you miss one out of the first 3 questions, you're going to go back and be, this is what this arrow is here. You're going to have to go back and start again. So this makes sure they're paying attention, right? Because you know how they love to brute force that stuff. And so if they get one wrong, they go back, they do it again, and now they are paying attention, I can assure you. This is hardly the most sophisticated AI. What we're doing to feed this impressometer is using number of words, number of correct multiple choice, and performance they did when they ran these experimental trials. And that actually feeds a single branch at the end. Do you want to redo the simulation, or did we decide you get to join the lab? You get to join the lab when this big green star is lit up. Woohoo! So as I said, branching and adaptivity are expensive. I understand that, but they're really worth it if you can just put a little bit in. You're invited to go through the simulation again at the end of this, and then it's your choice, and then we save all that data for the instructor to look at, and so he or she can see all your scores, and they'll care about your final score. They would probably care too if you went back multiple times, because you know what that shows? Grit. And that's another important word in education these days. Like, are you someone who got a low score and decided to go back a couple of times and do it again to get a better score? That is grit. So again, the premise is that you want to be accepted by this groovy research lab with the graduate students, and you're going to go into the grad lounge here, and you're going to enter this. They have these posters up, right? And you're going to enter this poster, which is like a portal, and you walk through it, and then suddenly you're in the experimental room, and then you're going to help them run an experiment. They're trying to figure out how people who are blind navigate through a novel room. So how do they not hit walls? And they do this very well. This is based on a real experiment done in the 1940s at Cornell University. So change the independent variables when you're in this room. So what you're doing is you're going into this room, it's you, your POV, your point of view, and you're changing certain independent variables, like putting a headset on our participant or not, you're putting a blindfold on him, you're putting a backpack on him, and you're making him walk. You're running a trial, and then you're going to score the outcome, and you're going to look for patterns in the outcome table. So let me run a movie and show you. So he's walking, and as you see, now he's hitting the wall. And when he hits the wall, you would score that as a hit or a miss. And then there's a pattern that you'll see on the table at the end. All right, now for your homework, please use the LORQ rubric that you're going to be able to download at embodied-games.com, or you can email me if you can't find it. And you're going to score something that's less complex than blind man. That's a whole 20 minutes. You don't have to do that unless you want to, or score something of your own or something that you made. But for sure, if you don't have any ideas about what to score, I would like for you to go and watch the centripetal force video. There are certain terms that we've trained participants to use in the experiment before they come in. It's short, it's a 3-minute long video, and it can be found here at ASU Teachers College. And copy that down, or maybe it'll be in some paperwork that we send out earlier. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. If you have any questions, email me, mina.johnson@asu.edu. The website again is embodied-games.com.